Carolyn Dube here. Oh, what's the play for today? Well, today I'm going to share with you what I do when I get a new art supply. I like to put it through its paces to see if it works with the things I like to do, get to know the characteristics of it. Now, the paint that I've recently ordered was Acrylic Gouache from Liquitex. It's a new paint from them, and I haven't used gouache much at all. So this is a fairly new experience for me. And gouache, well, what is acrylic gouache? Imagine if watercolors and acrylic paint had a love child, it would be this stuff. Now I am going to try it with colored pencils, with stenciling. I'm going to add water. I'm just going to put it through its paces here. But at the very end of the video, you're going to see the thing that this paint allows me to do that just might be a game changer. The thing that blew my mind that I actually didn't think it would work. I thought I was really taking a big risk, but it turns out I wasn't. Oh, and the other thing about these bottles, by the way, the bottles are kind of fun. So, oh, whoops. Okay, don't squeeze it when you take the cap off. But it's got this kind of tip, but the cool part is if you take the top off, you can get a brush in there so you can get everything out of it. And I really have to say, like the shape of this bottle, Liquitex, good job. The shape of these bottles alone is exciting to me because it allows me to put out just a very small amount of paint. And for someone like me who has a lead foot when it comes to paint, that's a big deal. Gouache has characteristics of watercolor, so I thought I'll bring in some water and we'll see what happens. Sometimes when I add water to paint, it just gets a real, well, watered down look to it. And this time, did not happen. Adding a little bit of water to it made it a little more translucent, but it spread around beautifully. I'm going to fill this entire page in with color, with these very carefully planned out brush strokes that I've got going on. Okay, I hope you heard the sarcasm there. This is not carefully planned. This is just getting color onto the page, testing out how the paint feels, trying some of it without much water, where it ends up being a little more opaque, thicker, and then some of it where it's got more water on the brush, more water added, and where it's got a more translucent look. When I'm trying out new paints, one of the things I also look for is how well they mix together. So if you take a blue and a red, do you get a pleasing purple? Or do you get some hideous form of mud? Sometimes when I work with paints, I get the hideous forms of mud. Now I didn't expect that to happen here simply because this is Liquitex professional grade stuff. What that's code for is it's artist grade, and it means it has a lot more pigment in it. So that means when you mix your colors together, you don't get weird things happening. One of the things about gouache is that it's a more opaque paint than watercolor. So that means you can layer things on top of each other. So if I take the paint more at full strength, meaning don't add a bunch of water to it, it's much more opaque, so I can layer colors on top of each other. I have that freedom and flexibility to make it opaque or translucent depending on how much water I add to it. So if I kind of dry off my brush here and I put it in yellow and I put it right on that purple, I'm still going to see bright yellow. So I love that it's not going to bleed through and that I can make a top color opaque just by using the paint the way it comes out of the bottle. So the colors work really well, but what about white? Is white going to be opaque on there, or is it going to be hard to see? I've made sure my paintbrush is pretty dry. That way I can use this stuff at full strength. And when I put it on, it was very opaque. And how would it smear? How would it spread around? Really, really nicely. Very creamy, very easy to spread around. I'm not very familiar with gouache, so to those of you that already know this stuff, this may have been obvious or what you'd expect, but for me, I was really surprised at how matte this stuff was as it dried. And that makes it different for me than most of the other acrylic paints that I play with. And if you're wondering where you can find acrylic gouache or specific colors that I'm using here, you can find the full supply list over on the blog at acolorfuljourney.com. I've got color all over the page. The whole thing's full of color, so I could stop at any time if I'm trying to build a background for my art journal page. But playing around with this stuff was just fun, so I kept adding more and more to it. I'm really liking the flexibility of being able to add a little bit of water to make it more translucent, or using it at full strength and getting more of an opaque look and being able to build up layers. But how is this stuff going to work with more of the art journaling mixed media fun stuff that I like to do? Things like stenciling, things like using colored pencils on it or pens. So without waiting for anything to dry, let's start getting some stenciling on here. Okay, well, it might be a few seconds here till we get to the stenciling because I'm still having fun putting that color on there, But I promise, very, very soon, I'm going to stop adding paint to the background and we're going to go on to the stenciling. I'm going to use a dark blue for this, and guess what? That's all the paint that I'm going to need for the stenciling. I'm going to dab my cosmetic sponge in it, and then I'm just going to start pouncing. If I want a crisp look, I'm going to go up and down, and if I start to, well, get into my old habits, I'm going to go side to side. The gouache paint dries really quickly, so when I go to put a second stenciling on here, I flip the stencil over, that way it looks more like it's not just completely perfectly repeated. And the paint's already dry on that side. That thin little bit of paint dried quickly, so that means I can just stencil right on here and not have any unexpected paint smears happening. So why is it that I like to flip the stencil over? Well, that way it looks a little more like a random pattern as opposed to just repeating the same thing over and over again. But you can tell from this video, it is the same thing that I'm repeating. But by flipping it over, by doing a little bit of overlapping, it takes on a different look than a stencil that was just repeated over and over again. So the acrylic gouache works really nicely with stencils, great coverage. I've been eyeing the bottle and looking at the tip of it that makes it so easy to squirt out a small amount of paint, and I'm just wondering if I can actually write or draw with that tip. Well, that would be a great big yes. So this is like a big mixed media kind of pen to put that paint on there. The more you squeeze the bottle, the more paint that comes out of it. But what about writing on it with something like a colored pencil? Would that be able to write on top of this? Well, let's find out. I'm going to bring in a stencil here. This is one called Open-Ended that I designed for over at StencilGirl Products. And I created this one because I like to put big, bold titles on things like art journal pages, but I'm not a big fan of my own handwriting. So this is one of the ways that I cheat. What I'm doing is tracing the letters here. This stencil can be used two ways. One where you're just tracing the lines and getting a sort of modern vibe to an alphabet, or with a few quick little lines, you close it in and get big block letters. Now, I'm absolutely terrible at spelling going forwards, and I'm about to spell this backwards, so I have to write it out on something like a Post-it note to help me know what letter to do next, or I'm going to misspell whatever. I misspell my own name when I spell it backwards. The reason why I start at the end of the word is because I usually know where I want it to end, and then I just work my way backwards, and that way it'll begin wherever it needs to, but I've at least got it spaced where I want it to go on the end. How am I getting these letters perfectly straight along here and evenly spaced? Well, I'm not. These things are actually not going to line up perfectly. I'm purposely making some higher, some lower. The spacing doesn't need to be precise. But should you want that, one of the things that you can do is put down a piece of washi tape, and that'll give you a baseline so that you can get them all at the same height if having them go straight across is important to you. Now, I was living on the edge as I was doing this. I was sure that the D in destiny would go beyond the middle of the book. But no, it is right smack at the middle, and I gotta tell you, I don't like that one bit. So we'll call that an oops, and I'll show you how I deal with that a little bit later in the video. Right now what I'm doing is coming along and just closing up the letters. I could have left them open if I want to do sort of an artsy look to it, but what I really wanted here were some block letters. So just quick straight lines, and now I've got something that I can fill in with paint. To make it easy to fill this in, I'm using a paintbrush that's about as wide as what these letters are. Because if you've seen many of my videos, you know how challenging it is for me to actually color within the lines. And if you haven't seen many of my videos and you don't know that about me yet, hit that subscribe button. That way you'll know as soon as I have a new video out. Okay, I didn't do a very good job staying within the lines. I've covered up some of the colored pencil. But the cool part is, because the colored pencil writes so easily over this gouache paint, that I can simply sketch it back on anywhere that I feel like I've covered it up too much. Since the colored pencil writes really easily on top of the gouache, that makes it a great tool for doing some journaling on the page. I hope by putting this journaling under the word destiny that I would be happier about the spacing, because I really wanted that word to spill onto the other page, and it didn't. So I'm going to call this an oops, an outstanding opportunity presenting suddenly. It didn't go the way I expected, but now it gives me the opportunity to use something I hadn't planned on using. These are the Figments of Imagination stencil and mask set that I designed, and you get all these little masks as well as the stencil. Now the perk of the masks is that you get to kind of test things out, audition them, see if you like where they're placed to give you the look before you actually stencil them. It's like auditioning them to find just the right place before you commit with the stencil and the paint. By adding these elements around the word, I suddenly was very happy with how it was spaced. So it turns out it was a good thing that I didn't get that D as far over as I wanted, or I never would have thought to bring in the figments. The purpose of this art journal page today was to put the acrylic gouache through its paces and see what it could do mixed media style. But there was one last thing that I wanted to test, but it was risky. I knew that something might have to be sacrificed for the sake of this test. I wanted to know if a fine-tipped pen could write on top of this. Now, usually when I use these fine-tipped pens on top of paint, they get destroyed within 1 to 2 words. So a pen volunteered for this dangerous mission of testing out, will it be able to write on top of this paint? This is a very super fine tip and the kind that clog up instantly almost when it comes to writing on top of paint, even when the paint is completely dry. So writing on regular paper over here, the pen works just fine. This pen is taking a great risk, willing to sacrifice everything to find out if it can write on top of this acrylic gouache. By this point, if it was on any other paint that I've used, this pen would be near death. But the pen's still working. And I'm, well, how shall I say, quite surprised. I even tested it back out on paper, and yep, it's still writing just the way it was before I did that. Now, I'm a skeptic about this. Was this pen just lucky, or will fine-tip pens really write on top of this and not be destroyed so quickly? So before I'm going to fully buy into this, I want to test another pen on here. Yep, I'm going to make another pen, put it all on the line here just to see if it'll work on it. I chose the pink one this time, and it's another one of those super fine tip pens. It writes just fine before I start this, and now I'm just going to start adding little bits here and there. When I have fine tip pens like this that have a kind of felt tip to them, I know to keep them away from paint because of how many I have destroyed, ruined, killed by just writing on paint. And this one, it's still doing fine with all of this. So for me right now, it's looking like pens can write pretty easily on top of this paint. Now keep in mind, I have not done a long 10-year study on this. I cannot say with 100% certainty about every pen in every situation, but I gotta tell you, right now I'm pretty surprised that these pens have held up this well, because any other time I've used these pens on top of paint, within 2 to 3 words at most, I've actually ruined the pen. And that's writing on top of completely dry paint. Well, thanks so much for joining me for today's play as I'm putting acrylic gouache through its paces. If you found this video helpful, if you had fun watching, I'd so appreciate it if you gave it a thumbs up. And of course, if you want to see more of my videos, hit that subscribe button. That way you'll know as soon as I have a new video out. Thanks so much for letting me be a part of your colorful journey.